Hey, hello everybody. I see everybody's returning. I'm going to be chairing the second panel. The format of the second panel will be similar to the first. We'll have three speakers speak for 15 minutes and followed by a brief discussion and another break. And now I'm going to introduce our second panel of speakers. Our first speaker will be Peter Hudis, professor at Oakland College in the US and author of Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism. Our second speaker will be Eleanor Boldon Mendeville, a scholar at Kassel University in Germany and University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. Our third speaker will be Lalan Kishore Singh, a longtime trade union activist associated with the revolutionary communist movement in India. He will be giving a speech in Hindi and then English translation will be read by Jonas. Okay, now I'd like to invite our first speaker, Peter Hudis. Peter, I think
Peter, you need to turn your microphone.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Lyndon, and for everybody else for your participation in this, in making this discussion possible, which will be continuing through the whole, for quite a few hours yet. Where I want to begin is the fact that there has been a long history of discussion, actually, and debate around Marx's critique of the Gotha Program. So a good question to ask is, why are we discussing it now, and how can our discussion of it provide some insights that perhaps earlier discussions may have missed? And so for my comments, I'm going to be focusing on one aspect that has been often neglected about Marx's critique, and that is that it was and is an organizational document. That reveals, perhaps more than any other of his writings, his concept of organization. And hopefully this will be a way also to respond to some of the very interesting discussion that was posted by Steve in the chat, Colatrello, and also Adan in the comments and others about this question of organization and how it may relate to what Marx was doing in 1875. As far as I know, Rada Dunayevskaya was the first person to single out the critique of the Gotha Program as an organizational document in a book published some 40 years ago, a book on Rosa Luxemburg, Women's Liberation, and Marx's Philosophy of Revolution. She elaborated on this a few years later in 1985 in an essay entitled Dialectics of Revolution and Women's Liberation. So if you allow me, I just want to quote briefly from something she said in that essay from 1985. She wrote the following, and I quote, "Only with the 1875 marginal notes," this is Dunayevskaya speaking, that we know as a critique of the Gotha Program, did Marx express his views directly on the program of a workers' party. Those marginal notes stress the impossibility for serious revolutionaries ever to separate philosophy of revolution from the actual organization. When a principle of philosophy and revolution is not in the program, one should never join that organization, though one could participate in individual joint action against capitalism," end quote. Now, this statement on her part, I don't think was an endorsement of sectarianism, which Marx himself always opposed. While there can be no bargaining about principles when it comes to advocating a genuine socialist alternative to capitalism, it's always possible and certainly often desirable to unite with those who do not share such principles, but who oppose various injustices. But one should never join a revolutionary Marxist organization that lacks such principles. Now, Marx, as we know, is active in many organizations prior to writing the critique of the Gotha Program. But none of them, whether it be the Communist League, the German Workers' Society, or the First International, were Marxist organizations. They were groups that consisted of many tendencies. It's true that some spoke of something called the Marx Party, I'm putting that in scare quotes, as early as 1849, but that referred to the small circle of Marx's associates, not to an actual political party. That changed only in 1869 when the first Marxist party, or at least so avowedly Marxist party, was formed in Germany called the Eisenachers. But by 1875, as we know, Marx became so disgusted with it for bargaining about principles that he threatened to have nothing to do with that party. So in what way does this critique of the Gotha Program define the role of a Marxist organization that exists independently of the spontaneous revolts of the masses? And what does it have to say about the role of revolutionary organization today? Well, I think what Marx objected, it seems to me, most of all about in the Gotha Program was his failure to adequately deal, and this is his words, with the future body politic of communist society. It instead limited itself to calling for a fair distribution of the products of labor, while saying nothing about abolishing value production, the drive to accumulate wealth in monetary form as an end in itself. This drive to augment ever more value or wealth in monetary form is neither natural nor inevitable. It's the expression of the reified form of social labor that is peculiar to capitalism. In other words, the measure of value in societies governed by the capitalist mode of production is a certain modality of time called socially necessary labor time, the amount of time on average that is necessary to produce a given commodity on the world market. This means that our labor and our lives count only as valuable, only insofar as they conform to an abstract time determination over which we have absolutely no control. Instead of freely organizing our time, socially necessary labor time makes us prisoners of time. That's why we seem to have less and less time the more commodified society becomes, even as more and more labor-saving devices are created by modern technology that are supposed to free up our time. That just doesn't happen because we're prisoners of a system based on the drive to augment economic value as an end in itself. For Marx, therefore, the abolition of capitalism hinges on subverting this abstract time determination. And that is achieved through common ownership of the means of production and reproduction, in which alienated or reified social labor is broken down and replaced by a free association of the producers. Once we are free to organize our lives as befits our natural and acquired talents and abilities, time no longer presents itself as a person apart, but serves as a space for human development. So in sum, the socialist or communist society that I think Marx is talking about is one in which no external force, whether it be the market or the state, dictates how we organize our time in work or anywhere else. Abolishing the capitalist law of value would allow surplus, disposable, or free time to become the measure of our social existence. Yes, we'd still need to work, but we would be able to maximize as much free time as possible now that we're in control of our laboring activity, instead of it being controlled by a capitalist class interested in maximizing profit for its own sake. Now, I don't think this was a distant utopian vision on Marx's part. The critique itself argues that class domination, alienated labor, and value production are all abolished in the initial first phase of socialism or communism, in which actual labor time, not socially necessary labor time, serves as a measure of production and distribution. This initial phase is, however, tainted by the birthmarks of the old society from which it springs, but it creates the basis for a higher phase in which free time, not labor time, becomes the measure of our existence. Now, remember, all this is projected in an organizational document that takes issue with the unity of two revolutionary workers' parties. So what does that suggest? I think it suggests that it's kind of telling us, at least implicitly, that what gives a revolutionary organization its historic right to exist is adhering to and promoting a viable concept of an alternative to capitalism. Now, tragically, this aspect of the critique of the Gotha Program did not get picked up upon by post-Marx Marxists, certainly not when it came to seeing in it at least an implicit concept of organization on Marx's part that was in some respects distinctive. The question is, why didn't they pick up on this? Well, I think one reason is that they didn't see a reason to speculate about the socialist future. The predominant view, not only in Marx's time, but for decades afterwards, was that socialism will naturally emerge from capitalism as private ownership gives way. At least many thought that socialism will naturally emerge from capitalism as private ownership gives way to larger units of capital and state ownership, thereby rendering superfluous any need to discuss a post-capitalist society. Others, of course, held something somewhat differently, held that socialism will spontaneously arise as workers achieve greater socialization due to the concentration and centralization of capital, thereby rendering any discussion of a post-capitalist society equally superfluous. Of course, there was others who simply didn't agree with Marx's critique, because in the critique, Marx states, and I'm quoting him, that in socialism or communism, in the lower phase, that is, the producers do not exchange their products, but instead exchange equal units of actual labor time. You work so many hours and you get that equivalent of goods or services in the number of hours you might work. His critique of the Gotha program just didn't seem relevant to organization, since it seemed irrelevant for leftist organizations to spend their time speculating about or even speaking about the vision of a future socialist society. So let me just quote another passage from that same essay of 1985 I mentioned earlier from Dunievskaya, where she takes up this question. She says the following, quote, "Did Marx's critique mean anything to those who called themselves Marxists? Clearly not to the whole leadership of the Second International. That historic turning point had not meant anything to the German leaders, and not only to the Lassalleans, but also to the Eisenachists, that is the Marxists, who considered themselves Marxists. And what of the internationalists?" She continues, "It took nothing short of the outbreak of World War I to have anyone turn to the critique of the Gotha program. The single person who did, Lenin, learned a great deal on the necessary destruction of the capitalist state, as his booklet State and Revolution shows. But he left the whole question of organization completely aside. It took our age, specifically Marxist-Humanists, before there was a serious grappling with the type of organization Marx was calling for and a reconnection of organization with his philosophy of revolution and permanence." End quote. That's the passage from Dunievskaya. So back to my own comments. So what's been lost in not seeing the critique of the Gotha program as an organizational document, and what's gained for today in reclaiming it as one? Well, I think the answer is that Marxist organizations spent a lot of time and energy in political organizing, theoretical projects, and attempts to gain state power without advancing a notion of what constitutes a socialist society free from value production. That may not have seemed to be such a problem when the forward march towards socialism seemed to be historically inevitable. But confidence in that has been shattered, as we know, by the rise of state capitalism on the one hand, and the desocialization of labor that defines much of today's post-industrial economies on the other. Who can plausibly claim today that either the progressive development of capitalism or the struggles against it in and of themselves assures the creation of a new society if the content of that society is not even articulated or propagated? Now, this doesn't mean that Marx's concept of the alternative to capitalism, of which the critique of the Gotha program at most provides a bare outline, is a mere utopia. The goal of a new society liberated from value production, socially necessary labor time, and discrimination based on class, race, and gender is imminent in many ongoing social struggles. And parties and theoreticians aren't needed. They're not needed to provide us with the consciousness that we want a different way of life by which to control our time instead of having some arbitrary force like the market of the state organizing our time for us. That kind of quest is imminent in all kinds of demands that are ongoing today. The strikes in many of the universities and colleges, and also Starbucks, etc., Amazon, organizing campaigns, many of which center on what? Organizing working time, shorter working hours, etc. That is time for to do things in life besides work, and be able to earn enough so that you have time to do things in your life besides work. Demands to control our own bodies and communities. Demands for nature to cease to be valued only insofar as it augments profits, etc. It's in this sense that, as C.L.R. James put it, this future is inherent in the present, that the kind of free organization of time that Marx envisions for a new society is the content of much of the struggles that we're currently involved in now. But of course, none of that doesn't mean that parties or theoreticians aren't needed. And I think the proof of that is found in the social consciousness generated by spontaneous revolts themselves. Again and again, we've seen evidence of people who are fighting for freedom, search out ideas, search out theories and organizations and parties that can assist their effort to develop an alternative to the oppression that binds them, and that can allow their struggle to continue beyond a particular spontaneous episode. They intuitively and often explicitly know that they can't get there on their own, even though the quest for an alternative comes from within them. Now, of course, theoreticians and parties can't get there on their own either, and can do nothing at all if they treat people as cannon fodder to build their reputations and organizations. But if revolutionary organizations do not view their central task as providing a philosophically grounded critique of capitalism and a viable conception of an alternative to capitalism, what purpose do they serve in the long run, other than competing for a struggle for power? So I would agree with a lot of the sentiments that were expressed both in the presenters' first session today and in the discussion that was just getting started about Marx's critique of the Gotha program supplies us with a way to rethink the question of organization and the need for organization, but by doing so in a way that we don't repeat the dead ends and the limitations and problems of the past. I want to end, therefore, with a comment by somebody who might not seem his ideas all that directly related to the critique of the Gotha program, but I think actually in a lot of ways is. One day I'll try to talk about that. The person is Frantz Fanon, because I think a challenge that he posed is relevant to our discussion. He wrote the following: "A person is perhaps only a compromise between life and death. But even though he may be only that, he must live on. He must live for nothing because he is there. He must seize life with both hands, head on like a gladiator. He must be a constant insult to destiny." I think we would do well with our lives as a constant insult to destiny.
Great. Thank you, Peter, for the very insightful talk. Next speaker, we'll have Eleonora, and then after we have Lalin. So, and by Eleonora, please speak.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. I had some technical problems. All right, so thank you very much for giving me the possibility to have a brief intervention. My intervention will basically briefly outline some of my research hypotheses, while hopefully embedding this into the debate on the new translation of Marx's critique of the Gotha program. As a Berlin-based scholar and German native speaker, the scope of not having neat translation into one's own working language comes afore only when I'm searching for the already published translations of classical texts, say by Hegel or Marx, that I read in its German original. In my own research, when writing in English, as I am for my PhD thesis, for example, I do spend quite some time finding suitable translations and many times correcting them from my own translations, as the published translations are so many times just not accurate enough for the point I want to bring across. Thus, neat translations that do justice to the original are dearly needed and facilitate scholarly and political work immensely. So thanks a lot for this very brilliant translation, first of all. Karl Marx notes on the program of the German Workers' Party from 1875, though published in 1891, so years after his passing, has resonated and resonates up until today with those committed to socialist world revolution. The German original in the Marx-Engels-Werke, MEW, I just reread it over here, encompasses only 17 pages and can be read quite quickly. It is something actually that within the German left, and especially socialist left, we do read kind of constantly. It's like a, yeah, it's one of the initiation texts that we will read next to the manifesto, etc. Marx commented on a variety of issues in his lifetime, we know that, yet the drastic shift from revolutionary social democracy to parliamentarian and reformist social democracy under Ferdinand Lassalle sparked immense outrage to the founding father of communism, a revolutionary movement to end all shackles of capitalism. Of course, a critique of similar projects today, let's say DSA in the US or the Linkspartei in Germany, needs an own analysis and critique. Surely we can find inspiration in these specific notes, but we need to elaborate our own analysis after 150 years of historical experiences of success and defeat, and let's be honest, mostly defeat as world socialist movement, right? Thus, I also feel cautious about this publication and how people will handle it. Will it try to find, let's say, easy way outs to actual own analysis of our own time? What I understand needs to be done is a reframing of our own politics as socialists, including an honest self-critique concerning our own opportunism as a movement and the lack of movement-based theory production beyond a liberal framework. Gotha Program and I have tried to gather some cornerstone critiques on the hegemonic liberal forms of anti-racism in Germany, in the German context, with our anthology, with the name The Diversity of Exploitation, a critique of dominant anti-racism, which we published last year actually in German, and will be hopefully translated this year and published this year with Brill and Haymarket in English. Let's see how that goes. So we concentrated there on anti-racism and the forms liberal anti-racism take in the specific German context. And we try to criticize this from a critique of political economy perspective. So what is to be done? I believe that the question of what exact role gender and race as economic social formations take in our modern capitalist world is more than ever a central concern for socialist organizing. This is also what my PhD thesis kind of tries to focus on. Thus, I want to present some of the ideas I'm trying to elaborate there. Especially in times when these social relations, gender and race, have statically been freeze often into monolithic identities, socialists need to show a way out of this postmodern individualism and essentialism. One important insight I suggest is to understand gender and race as forms of mediation of specific forms of exploitation, manifesting forms of super exploitation that need to be ideologically legitimized and naturalized. So what do I mean by super exploitation? And this is something I want to briefly outline. By analyzing Marx's labor theory of value in chapter 4 of Capital, we understand that value as an abstraction holds multiple moments that require their own particular economic analysis each. Hence, the very premise of surplus value production, so money becomes more money, M becomes M dash. So what interests me here is the question, if we look at really existing capitalisms, so the capitalisms that we breathe and we are exploited in every day, right? What are the concrete economic factors? What are the ideological formations what are the concrete economic factors that make ideological formations such as gender and race be infused into this equation, into money becoming more money, right? So where do we find factors of gender and race in this equation? To answer this question, I make use of the concept of super exploitation in a specific form. In Capital Volume 1 and 3, Marx gives a short overview of his understanding of super exploitation, though he does not specifically use this term, Überausbeutung in German, super exploitation. I mean, Mauro Marini has worked on this on the international scale, especially looking into forms of imperialism and how super exploitation works on an international scale. What I'm trying to do here is also looking into how within a national framework, super exploitation as a concept can be used. So Marx describes the level of exploitation that increased the exploitation rate of a single worker by making one worker get the work done that 2 or 3 workers did before, through, say, lengthening the working day, cutting off wages per hour, or the use of advanced machinery. Super exploitation has had multiple meanings for Marxists and non-Marxists alike. For the German context, Janina Puder has tried to give an overview on this in her research, accumulation, super exploitation, migration. And this debate is kind of a longer debate on how to use this concept of super exploitation if this concept makes sense. So I want to present the way that me and Gotha Program we're using this concept. My understanding of super-exploitation highlights the different conditions of exploitation to which groups of workers are exposed. Thus, although ideally there is a socially average level of exploitation that determines wage levels and working hours in a given society, legal differentiations between different population sectors, say according to their residence status or according to their race or nationality, do still exist and offer the possibility of undermining this general level of exploitation. This means that due to the different conditions of exploitation, life situations and immediate interests within the working class, also within one national framework, are very much differentiated. The really existing divided working class is, among other factors, a product of the different conditions of exploitation, of the diversity of exploitation. Examples of this can be currently found in the seasonal work, mostly Eastern and Southeastern European workers doing the agricultural or meat processing sector of the German economy, meaning they have a few months contracts, under very strict regulations. They're not allowed to quit their job. They're not allowed to organize. So they work under very different conditions than the conditions that German workers have fought for, right? So we have a very differentiated level of exploitation there. Or historically in the so-called guest workers in the Federal Republic or contract workers in the German Democratic Republic, which came in a context of organized mass migration starting in the 1950s up to the 1970s, and then people they tried to send people back, but actually people stayed. I thus suggest that through a study of statistical data of any given society, we can concretely estimate the super exploitation rate of, for example, women and or migrants and their descendants. My argument stresses that it is a scientific method of dialectical historical materialism that we learned from Marx and Engels that allows us to unfold the multiple potentials of super exploitation, and that this takes in the mediation of through gender and race. Very briefly, what I call the political economy of gender and race. I do not think that we need ever longer adjectivizations like David Camfield suggests to incorporate the most radical understandings of our current societies into our scientific methodology as Marxists. Thus, it is not an anti-racist, queer, feminist historical materialism we need, but much rather a thorough analysis of the appearance of such adjectivization phenomenon in itself. Why is historical materialism not enough anymore? Thus, bringing together the insights of the relation of exploitation and super exploitation, I hope to give a different kind of political analysis. Here, the role of the ever more differentiated transnational division of labor and the form of combined and uneven development under rival imperialisms will need to be taken into account in order to highlight the specific forms of super exploitation within the political economy of gender and race created by international imperialist institutions such as, say, IMF, the World Bank, development agencies such as GIZ in the German context. Yet the great merit of any thriving theoretical tradition is its ability to critically reflect upon its own assumptions and, when appropriate, to draw upon and absorb significant elements from other theoretical traditions. This was a quote by Alexander Anievasha and Kedemir Shanshiolu. The political economy of gender and race is thus situated within the nexus of specific forms of surplus value production. Contrary to the liberal conception, from a dialectical materialist perspective, society is not simply a sum of individuals, but it is determined by the way how people relate to each other in order to organize the production and reproduction of their lives together. Yet this very liberalism, hegemonic in progressive circles since the early 1990s, has taken over the mass majority of leftist political activism and radical thinking. The identity politics that emerged in the late 1960s have in all practicability lost any form of class connection, at least the way that we can see it in Europe here. By this, I do not mean that the majority of people active around these diverse social and economic questions are not workers, but that their politics are not stemming from the universal category of the working class and the world proletariat as the central subject of a socialist revolution. Thus, instead of understanding identity as a specific form of mediation between labor and capital, as I'm proposing, Identity categories become static and a source for further division and particularity. Yet a particularity without universality gives way to a non-dialectical view of the question, of the important questions we're asking. Any anti-capitalist slogan and or organizing gets confused for actual class power building socialist politics. The centrality of the working class as the only historical subject has the economic position in the production process that can actually hold and alter the capitalist mode of production needs thus to be refocused and brought back to the core of our analysis and politics. This very working class has globally never been more industrialized, more non-white, and more female than ever. This multi-diverse, multi-layered, super profit-producing class has to be understood in all its potential again, as the force that can directly dissolve the current order of production through collective action, breaking the divisions and fragmentations of its inner levels of oppression and super-exploitation. For this, socialist organizations are needed that organize politically on a class base for a socialist future. And I believe that this is exactly what Marx's critique of the Gotha Program should teach us today, that we have to understand the centrality of working class, but also further elaborate what our new questions are that Marx couldn't even ask in the way that we're asking today, because we have a new society, we have other problems, we have 150 years that we move forward. So let's get it started. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eleonora. It's very interesting to hear how these issues play out, especially in the German context. Our next speaker will be Lalan. Again, he'll be speaking in Hindi, and Jonas will read an English translation. So Lalan, I invite you to the floor.
Start.
Yes, you can start.
आज के दिन जब हम चर्चा में भाग ले रहे हैं तो आज का दिन पेरिस कम्यून का है, इसलिए हम पहले पेरिस कम्यून के उन सभी शहीद मजदूर साथियों को क्रांतिकारी अभिनंदन करते हैं। साथ ही साथ अपने IMHO के साथियों का भी अभिनंदन करते हैं, क्योंकि चर्चा के लिए उन्होंने आज का दिन चुना। पेरिस कम्यून के मजदूर दुनिया के मजदूरों को यह संदेश जरूर दे रही है कि दुनिया में बदलाव संभव है, बशर्ते बदलाव के लिए ईमानदारी से संघर्ष की शुरुआत तो हो। पेरिस के मजदूरों ने जब यह महसूस किया कि समाज से शोषण, मुनाफा और अतिरिक्त मूल्य तभी खत्म होगा जब राज पूर्ण रूप से खत्म होगा। इसके लिए मजदूरों के बीच आपस में गहन चर्चा होती थी और जो भी निर्णय होता था वह मजदूरों के अंदर का निर्णय होता था, कहीं कोई बाहर से निर्णय नहीं होता था। पेरिस कम्यून के मजदूर दुनिया के मजदूरों को यही तो शिक्षा दे रहे हैं कि मजदूरों के अंदर का निर्णय और खुद के संगठन के द्वारा ही दुनिया में परिवर्तन संभव है, जिसमें साम्यवाद, समाजवाद के लिए राज का विध्वंस होना नित्यान्त आवश्यक है। कार्ल मार्क्स के दर्शन में राज का नाश विशेष रूप से है, जिसमें वे आलोचना करने में कंजूसी नहीं किए हैं। उदाहरण के तौर पर प्रूडॉन और हीगेल की आलोचना। कार्ल मार्क्स की यह विशेषता है कि बीमारी को दूर करने के लिए वे बीमारी की जड़ में जाकर बीमारी को खोजते हैं। इसीलिए मार्क्स बीमारी की जड़ में जाते हैं, बीमारी को खोजते हैं और फिर आलोचना करते हैं। उनकी अपनी यह विशेषता रहा है, वे बड़े ही निर्दयी और निर्मोही तरीके से आलोचना करते हुए रास्ते पर आते हैं। गोथा कार्यक्रम की आलोचना में मार्क्स यही करते हैं। एक तरफ गोथा कार्यक्रम की आलोचना करते हैं तो दूसरी तरफ उपयोगी श्रम की बात करते हैं, जिसमें मानव श्रम रखते हैं, लेकिन प्रकृति को भी नजरअंदाज नहीं करते, बल्कि मानव श्रम के साथ प्रकृति को भी जोड़ते हैं। अंतरराष्ट्रीय मार्क्सवादी मानवतावादी संगठन की तरफ से क्रिटिक ऑफ गोथा कार्यक्रम पर किताब निकाला है, जिसमें बहुत कुछ स्पष्ट रूप से रखा गया है। किताब आने के बाद भी हमारा सवाल आज भी बरकरार है जो हमने मार्क्स से पूछे थे। हमारा वह लेख आइए मार्क्स से पूछते हैं IMHO के जनरल में प्रकाशित हुआ। शायद आप लोग हमारे सवाल से अवगत होंगे। अब हम आलोचना में न जाते हुए इस बात पर जाते हैं कि आखिर गोथा कार्यक्रम में क्या कमी थी जिसके लिए मार्क्स को आलोचना करना पड़ा। कमी एक, गोथा कार्यक्रम वर्ग की सामग्री पर नहीं है बल्कि देश के भीतर की सामग्री पर है। दो, मजदूर वर्ग पर अंतरराष्ट्रीय जिम्मेदारी पर एक भी शब्द का उल्लेख नहीं है। तीन, अंतरराष्ट्रीय श्रमिक संघ सत्ता के निर्माण के लिए इस तरह की गतिविधियों का प्रयास नहीं कर सकते। चार, सभी सामाजिक और राजनीतिक असमानताओं का उन्मूलन का बयान स्पष्ट नहीं है। आर्थिक सामाजिक दर्शन का अभाव है। समाजवाद को एक ऐसी टोपी के रूप में रखा है जिसे आवश्यकता अनुसार उपयोग कर सके और पहना जा सके। इसमें ऐतिहासिक कार्य और वर्ग व्यवस्था का अंत करना नहीं दिखता है। हमारा काम, हमारी घोषणा कम्युनिस्ट राजनीति ही काम करेगा के ऊपर दिवालियापन स्पष्ट रूप से दिखता है। साथ ही साथ मौजूदा राज का क्या होगा इसका स्पष्ट व्याख्या नहीं है। आखिर में मार्क्स के गोथा कार्यक्रम की आलोचना का निचोड़ क्या निकलता है? निचोड़ उत्पादन के साधनों पर निजी स्वामित्व का समाप्त होना जो हजारों साल से सामाजिक वर्गों के बीच संघर्ष का आधार रहा है। दो, पूंजीवाद के अंतर विरोध को उजागर किए हैं और विनाश की ओर ले जाने वाले तत्वों की पहचान की है। तीन, श्रम को श्रम शक्ति के बिना नहीं समझा जा सकता। श्रम शक्ति के लिए मूल्य को समझना और मूल्य के लिए अतिरिक्त मूल्य पर विचार करना। राजनीतिक लोकतंत्र हासिल होने से मानव की मुक्ति नहीं होगी। मजदूर वर्ग का स्वतंत्र आंदोलन खड़ा हो जिसमें अंतरराष्ट्रीय दृष्टिकोण हो। गोथा कार्यक्रम में रूढ़िवादियों ने मार्क्सवादी दृष्टिकोण के विपरीत समाज के लिए विक्षिप्त उदारवादी तरीका लाया है। मानव जरूरत के हिसाब से समाज से लेगा और समाज के जरूरत के हिसाब से समाज को देगा। इस तरह से प्रत्येक नागरिक सार्वजनिक होगा जिसमें समाज में कुछ भी किसी का नहीं होगा, न तो व्यक्तिगत संपत्ति के रूप में या पूंजीगत वस्तुओं के रूप में। वर्तमान परिस्थिति पूरे दुनिया में सत्ता के लिए राजनीति हो रही है। सत्ता व्यवस्था के लिए काम करती है। व्यवस्था पूंजी के हित देखती है। पूंजी का मुनाफा बाजार पर आधारित होता है। बाजार पर कब्जा करने के लिए पूंजी आज नरभक्षी बना हुआ है, जिसके लिए पूंजी ने पूरे दुनिया को बारूद के ढेर पर बैठा दिया है, जिसका प्रत्यक्ष प्रमाण रूस और यूक्रेन युद्ध, भारत पाकिस्तान का दुश्मनी रिश्ता, चीन ताइवान पर हमले को तैयार, उत्तर कोरिया का आणविक शक्ति का परिचय देना। उस समय जब मार्क्स गोथा कार्यक्रम की आलोचना कर रहे थे तब उनके सामने ये परेशानी और समस्या नहीं थी जो आज हम सबके सामने है। पूंजी ने मानवता और मानव श्रम को निगलने के लिए भक्षक का रूप अख्तियार कर लिए हैं, जिसके ऊपर अपनी राय वैज्ञानिक स्टीफन हॉकिंस ने भी जाहिर की है। गोथा कार्यक्रम की आलोचना के साथ साथ हमें उन बिंदुओं पर भी ध्यान देना होगा जो मानवता के हित में और मार्क्सवादी दृष्टिकोण से सही हो, जिसमें जीवंत श्रम को अपनी शक्ति के रूप में तकनीकी विकास को अपने अधीन रखना, ताकि मृत श्रम जो पूंजी का रूप लेती है उसे विनाशकारी अख्तियार करने से रोकना होगा। बिंदु अतिरिक्त मूल्य। 2, प्रकृति को लेकर भविष्य खतरे में। 3, आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंसी। 4, ब्रह्मांड का नाश। और 5, अंतरिक्ष में सिग्नल का आदान प्रदान इत्यादि। ऐसी विषम परिस्थिति में दुनिया के मजदूरों के साथ साथ IMHO का भी यह दायित्व बनता है कि मानवता को जिंदा रखने के लिए दुनिया के मजदूरों में एक अंतर्राष्ट्रीय दृष्टिकोण की सोच के आधार पर एक अंतर्राष्ट्रीय मजदूर संगठन के गठन पर विचार हो, जो गोथा कार्यक्रम की आलोचना के निचोड़ से भी निकलता है। थैंक यू।
Okay, thank you, Lalan. For those of you who didn't follow I'll read a translation of what Lalan just said. My name is Jonas. I'm based in the north of Sweden, and we have a translation here that a comrade to us called Sahor has made. Sahor lives in Kashmir in India, but he was unfortunately couldn't attend for this meeting tonight, so I will be reading out his translation. So it goes like this. Today, when we are participating in this discussion, is the day of the Paris Commune. Therefore, we first of all extend revolutionary greetings to all those martyred working comrades of the Paris Commune, as well as of the International Marxist-Humanist organization. Let's also congratulate our colleagues for choosing today for the discussion. The workers of the Paris Commune are definitely giving this message to the workers of the world. Change in the world is possible only if the struggle for change is started honestly. The workers of Paris realized that exploitation, profit, and surplus value would end in society only when the state was completely abolished. For this, there used to be a deep discussion among the laborers before whatever decision was taken. It was an internal decision of the workers. There was no decision from outside. This is what the workers of the Paris Commune are teaching the workers of the world. Change in the world is possible only through the decision of the workers and their own organization, in which the destruction of the state is absolutely necessary for communism and socialism. In the philosophy of Karl Marx, the destruction of the state is something special, in which he, Marx, has not been stingy to criticize. For example, the criticism of Proudhon and Hegel is based on the characteristic of Karl Marx that he uses the disease to cure the disease. Let's find the disease by going to its root. So Marx goes to the root of the disease to find out and then criticize. This has been his own specialty. They grow only when they come on the way criticizing mercilessly and vehemently. This is what Marx does in his criticism of the Gotha Program. On the one hand, they criticize the Gotha Program, and on the other hand, they talk about the useful labor in which human labor is kept. But nature is not ignored, but nature is also linked with human labor. A book has been brought out on the program in which many things have been clearly laid out. Gaia criticizes Papa and, on the other hand, talks about useful labor in which human labor is kept, but does not ignore nature, but also connects nature with human labor. On behalf of the International Marxist-Humanist organization, a book has been brought out on the critique of the Gotha Program. Here was a repetition. Even after the publication of the book, our question remains the same as the one we asked Marx. That article of ours on Marx was published by the iMade show. Maybe you guys are aware of our main question. Now, without going into criticism, we got to the point that what was lacking in the Gotha Program for which Marx had to criticize is that, and here comes a couple of points. A, the Gotha Program is not focused on the content of the class, but on the content within the country. B, not a word is mentioned about the international responsibility of the working class. C, international trade unions cannot attempt such activities to build power. D, the statement of abolition of all social and political inequalities is not clear. E, lack of economic social philosophy. Lack of economic social philosophy. Socialism has been kept in the form of a cap that can be used and worn as needed. F, it does not see the historical work and the abolition of the class system. G, our work, our declaration that communist politics will only work. Bankruptcy is clearly visible, as is what will happen to the current state. There's no clear explanation for this. In the end, what is the gist of the criticism of Marxist Gotha Program? And here comes a few more bullet points. 1, the abolition of private ownership of the means of production, which existed for thousands of years. It has been the basis of conflict between social classes. 2, the internal contradictions of capitalism have been highlighted, and the elements leading to destruction have been identified. 3, labor cannot be understood without the price of manpower, considering the added value of the price. 4, the attainment of political democracy will not lead to the liberation of man. 5, there should be an independent movement of the working class that has an international outlook. 6, the conservatives in the Gotha Program advocated socialism as opposed to the Marxist approach. For this, a deranged liberal approach has been taken. 7, man will take from the society according to his needs and will give to the society according to the needs of the society. In this way, every citizen will be public, in which nothing in the society will belong to anyone either as personal property or as capital goods. Current situation. Politics is happening all over the world for power. Power works for the system. The system looks after the interests of capital. Capital gains are based on the market. To capture the market, capital today has become a cannibal for which it has made the whole world sit on a pile of gunpowder. The direct proof of which is the Russia-Ukraine war and India-Pakistan's enmity. China prepares to attack Taiwan and North Korea in order to introduce nuclear power. At that time, when Marx was criticizing the Gotha Program, he was not faced with the troubles and problems that we are all facing today. Capital has taken the form of an eater to swallow humanity and human labor, on which scientist Stephen Hawking has also expressed his opinion. Along with the criticism of the Gotha Program, we have to pay attention to those points that are correct in the interest of humanity and from the Marxist point of view, in which live labor is considered as its strength. To keep technological progress under control so that the dead labor that takes from the form of capital must be prevented from taking over destructively. Point 1, value added. 2, nature in danger. 3, artificial intelligence. 4, destruction of the universe. 5, signal exchange in space, etc. With the workers of the world in such an odd situation. To keep humanity alive, the workers of the world should consider the formation of an international labor organization based on the thought of an international approach, which also emerges from the essence of the criticism of the Gotha Program. Lalan Kishore Singh, Nagpur in India.
Okay. Thank you, Lalan, for the brilliant speech, and Jonas for the translation. We'll now be moving into our discussion period.